"Don't sign those papers." The desperation in my 12-year-old grandson's voice cut through me like a knife. I was sitting at my mahogany dining table in Phoenix, Arizona, fountain pen hovering over documents that would change everything, when little Michael burst through the front door with tears streaming down his face. My hand froze mid-air as I looked into his panicked green eyes, the same eyes his mother Sarah had inherited from me. "Grandma Eleanor, please don't sign anything, please," he begged, his small fists clenched at his sides as he stood there in his soccer uniform, grass stains on his knees and pure terror written across his freckled face. In that moment, something deep in my 74-year-old bones told me to listen to this child, to put down that pen and hear what he had to say. You see, I'd been about to sign over the deed to my late husband's antique restoration business, the workshop where Frank had spent 43 years of our marriage breathing life back into forgotten treasures. The business that our daughter Sarah had been pressuring me to transfer to her name for months, claiming it was for tax purposes, for my own protection, for the family's financial security. But as I looked at Michael's tear-stained face, every grandmother's instinct I'd developed over 7 decades began screaming that something was terribly, horribly wrong. Let me take you back to understand how we reached this moment, because the story doesn't begin with papers on a table or a panicked grandson. It begins 3 years earlier, when my beloved Frank passed away from a sudden heart attack at age 76, leaving me not just heartbroken, but completely overwhelmed by the business he'd built from nothing. Frank's antique restoration had been his passion project, started in our garage back in 1978 when Sarah was just 10 years old. Over the decades, it had grown into one of Phoenix's most respected restoration shops, with a client list that included museums, wealthy collectors, and families wanting to preserve their heirloom furniture. But Frank had always handled the business side of things while I managed our household and worked part-time as a librarian. When he died, I found myself staring at ledgers full of numbers I didn't understand, insurance policies written in legal jargon that might as well have been hieroglyphics, and a workshop filled with half-finished projects worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The business was profitable, that much I could see from the bank statements, but the day-to-day operations felt impossibly complex for a woman who had spent her career organizing books, not managing craftsmen, and dealing with high-end clients. That's when Sarah stepped in, my only child, 45 years old, and recently divorced from her husband of 15 years. She'd always been ambitious, working her way up to regional manager at a luxury hotel chain, and she assured me that her business experience made her the perfect person to help me navigate Frank's legacy. "Mom, you can't possibly handle all this complexity at your age," she'd say with that patronizing tone that adult children sometimes use when they think they know what's best for their parents. "Let me take care of the business aspects while you focus on grieving and healing." At first, her help seemed like a godsend. Sarah would come over every weekend, sitting at this very dining table where I now sat with those papers, going through invoices and client communications with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades in corporate management. She helped me understand which projects were most urgent, which clients needed immediate attention, and how to manage the 3 skilled craftsmen Frank had employed. The business continued to operate smoothly, and I felt grateful to have such a capable daughter willing to sacrifice her weekends to help her widowed mother. But somewhere around the 6-month mark, Sarah's weekend visits became weekday appearances. She'd show up at the workshop during business hours, taking meetings with clients and making decisions about pricing and project timelines without consulting me. When I asked about it, she'd explain that time-sensitive decisions couldn't wait for our weekend meetings, that clients were calling her directly because they knew she was handling the business aspects. It made sense, I suppose, but it also made me feel increasingly disconnected from the company Frank had built with his own hands. Then the suggestions started. Small ones at first, like modernizing the bookkeeping system and setting up online payment processing. These were reasonable improvements that Frank, with his old-fashioned ways, had resisted for years. But gradually, Sarah's suggestions became more significant, more controlling. She wanted to hire a business manager, expand into antique sales rather than just restoration, move the workshop to a larger facility in a more commercial area. Each suggestion came with detailed explanations about market opportunities and competitive advantages, delivered in the confident tone of someone who'd spent years climbing corporate ladders. "Mom, you have to think about maximizing the potential of what Dad built," she'd say during our increasingly frequent business discussions. "This workshop could be worth 3 times what it is now with the right management and strategic planning. But it needs someone with real business expertise to unlock that value." The implication was always clear, that someone was her, not me, not the woman who'd been married to the craftsman who'd built this business from nothing. Michael, bless his heart, had been spending more time with me since his grandfather's death. His parents' divorce had been finalized just months before Frank passed away, and I think being in the familiar warmth of his grandparents' house provided him with stability during a time when everything else in his young life felt uncertain. He'd sit in Frank's old recliner doing homework while I puttered around the kitchen making his favorite snickerdoodle cookies, and on weekends he'd come with me to the workshop, fascinated by the craftsman who continued Frank's work of bringing damaged antiques back to their former glory. It was during one of these weekend visits to the workshop that I first noticed Michael's concerned expressions when his mother would arrive for her business meetings. He'd watch Sarah interact with Frank's employees, see her making decisions and giving instructions, and I could tell something about the dynamic troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate at his age. The first real warning sign came about 18 months after Frank's death, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Sarah had been pushing me to formalize her role in the business, suggesting that we needed clear legal documentation of her responsibilities and decision-making authority. "Mom, we need to protect both of us," she'd explained during one of our kitchen table conferences, spreading out papers that looked official and intimidating. "If something happens to you, if you get sick or have an accident, someone needs to have the legal authority to keep Dad's business running. We can't let everything he built just disappear because of paperwork complications." Her reasoning sounded logical, even caring. I was 74 years old, and while I felt healthy and sharp, I couldn't deny that age brought vulnerabilities. The idea that Frank's life's work might crumble due to legal technicalities if something happened to me was genuinely frightening. So I agreed to meet with Sarah's lawyer, a smooth-talking man in an expensive suit who specialized in estate planning and business transitions. The lawyer, Mr. Davidson, laid out what he called a succession plan that would ensure business continuity while protecting my interests. Sarah would become the managing partner with full operational authority, while I retained ownership and would receive all profits after business expenses. It seemed like a reasonable compromise that would give Sarah the authority she needed to run things efficiently while keeping me as the ultimate owner of Frank's legacy. But when Michael was with me during one of these legal discussions, I noticed how quiet he became, how his usually bright demeanor would shift to something more watchful and worried. "Grandma," he asked me one evening after Sarah and the lawyer had left, "why does Mom need to be in charge of Grandpa's shop? You're still here. You're still smart. Couldn't you learn to do the business stuff yourself?" His innocent question planted a seed of doubt that I tried to ignore but couldn't quite shake. The second warning sign was more subtle, but perhaps more telling. Sarah had always been particular about money, even as a child, but her focus on the financial aspects of Frank's business began to feel excessive. Every conversation seemed to circle back to profit margins, expansion opportunities, and what she called unrealized value. She'd bring up comparable businesses that had sold for impressive sums, market trends that suggested antique restoration was a growth industry, and strategic partnerships that could dramatically increase our revenue. "Mom, do you realize that Dad was essentially running a boutique operation when he could have been building a real enterprise?" she'd say with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered hidden treasure. "His reputation and client relationships are worth so much more than just the workshop and tools. We could franchise this, create a brand, maybe even write a book about his restoration techniques. The possibilities are endless with the right business approach." While her excitement was infectious, something about these conversations made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't fully explain. Frank had never been motivated by money beyond what was needed to support our family and maintain his high standards of craftsmanship. He'd turned down lucrative contracts if they meant compromising his work or rushing through projects that deserved careful attention. The idea of turning his artisanal passion into a real enterprise felt like a fundamental misunderstanding of what he'd actually built. Michael, with the clarity that sometimes comes from a child's perspective, put it perfectly one Saturday afternoon when we were at the workshop watching one of Frank's craftsmen carefully restore a 19th century writing desk. "Grandma, Mom talks about Grandpa's shop like it's just about making money, but Grandpa always said it was about bringing beautiful things back to life. Those are different things, aren't they?" Out of the mouths of babes. My 12-year-old grandson had identified something that I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. Sarah was treating Frank's business like a commodity to be optimized rather than a craft to be preserved. And increasingly, her optimization plans seemed to require my stepping aside so she could implement her vision without what she called generational resistance to change. The pressure intensified significantly about 6 months ago when Sarah presented what she called the final solution to our business arrangement challenges. She'd found a buyer, she announced with barely contained excitement, a corporate restoration company that specialized in acquiring established workshops and integrating them into a larger network. They were offering what she described as an incredible sum for Frank's business, enough to ensure my comfortable retirement while giving her a substantial finder's fee that would help her start fresh after her divorce. "Mom, this is the perfect opportunity for both of us," she'd said, her eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm I remembered from her childhood when she'd discovered something she desperately wanted. "You get financial security without any of the stress of managing a business you never wanted to run, and I get the capital I need to start my own consulting firm. It's a win-win situation that Dad would have supported if he'd known how much stress this was causing you." But was it causing me stress? As I reflected on Sarah's assertion, I realized that the stress I'd been feeling wasn't from managing Frank's business, but from the constant pressure to change it, to optimize it, to treat it like a problem that needed solving rather than a legacy that deserved protecting. The craftsmen Frank had trained were still creating beautiful work, clients were still seeking our services, and the business was profitable enough to support itself and provide me with a comfortable income. The only stress came from the weekly meetings where Sarah would present new plans for transformation. When I suggested that maybe we didn't need to sell, that perhaps I was more capable of learning the business side than we'd initially thought, Sarah's reaction was swift and sharp. "Mom, you're 74 years old. Do you really want to spend whatever years you have left worrying about insurance policies and tax obligations and employee management? Wouldn't you rather travel, spend time with Michael, enjoy your retirement while you're still healthy enough to appreciate it?" The guilt trip was expertly executed, I had to admit. Sarah had always been skilled at framing her desires as concerns for others, a talent that had probably served her well in her hotel management career. But something about the way she dismissed my capabilities, the assumption that age automatically meant incompetence, stirred a defiance in me that I hadn't felt in years. Frank had been 76 when he died, still working with steady hands and sharp eyes, still taking on complex restoration projects that younger craftsmen might have found challenging. Why was 74 supposed to be the age when I became too feeble to learn new skills or make important decisions? Michael, who had been listening to these conversations with the careful attention that children pay to adult discussions that might affect their world, began asking me questions that revealed a wisdom beyond his years. "Grandma, if you sell Grandpa's workshop, where will Mr. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen and Mrs. Patterson work?" he asked, referring to the 3 skilled craftsmen who had become like family over the years they'd worked with Frank. "Mom keeps talking about the new owners keeping everyone, but she doesn't sound like she really knows if that's true." He was right, of course. Sarah's assurances about employee retention were vague and conditional, peppered with corporate speak about synergies and restructuring for efficiency. When I asked for specifics about what would happen to Frank's employees, Sarah would wave away my concerns with promises that good craftsmen always find work, and reminders that we can't make decisions based on sentiment when real money is at stake. But Frank's workshop wasn't just about money, and his employees weren't just skilled labor to be optimized or discarded. Rodriguez had been with us for 12 years, ever since Frank had hired him, fresh out of a woodworking program, and trained him in the delicate art of antique restoration. Chen had started as a part-timer while finishing her art degree, and had become Frank's specialist in intricate metalwork and hardware restoration. Patterson, a recent widow herself, had joined us just 2 years ago and found in the workshop not just employment, but a community of people who understood the healing power of bringing broken things back to wholeness. These weren't just employees, they were Frank's legacy in human form. The craftspeople he'd mentored and trained, the ones who carried forward his techniques and standards. The thought of selling the business to a corporation that might view them as expendable made me feel physically ill, like I was betraying not just Frank's memory, but the trust he'd placed in me to protect what he'd built. It was around this time that I began to notice changes in how Sarah interacted with Michael during their visits to my house. Where she'd previously been patient with his questions about the workshop and his grandfather's work, she now seemed irritated by his interest, often cutting him off or redirecting his attention to other activities. "Michael, stop bothering Grandma with all these business questions," she'd say, with a sharpness that made him flinch. "These are grown-up decisions that don't concern children." But Michael's questions weren't bothering me. They were helping me think through aspects of the situation that I might have overlooked. His fresh perspective, unclouded by adult assumptions about financial optimization and business efficiency, kept bringing me back to the fundamental question of what Frank would have actually wanted for his life's work. One evening, about 3 months ago, Michael and I were looking through photo albums of Frank's restoration projects when he found a picture of his grandfather working on a Civil War-era cavalry sword, his face focused in concentration as he carefully cleaned decades of tarnish from the brass guard. "Grandpa looks so happy in this picture," Michael observed, tracing his finger along the image. "He always looked happy when he was fixing things. Do you think he'd be happy if strangers were fixing things in his workshop instead of the people he taught?" The innocence of the question hit me like a thunderbolt. In all of Sarah's presentations about maximizing value and ensuring financial security, she'd never once asked what Frank would have wanted. She'd spoken about protecting his legacy, but her definition of legacy seemed to begin and end with converting his work into cash. Michael's simple question forced me to consider whether selling the business might actually be the opposite of protecting Frank's legacy. That night, I called Chen, one of Frank's craftsmen, and asked if I could meet with her at the workshop the next day. I'd been avoiding the workshop lately, partly because Sarah had convinced me that my presence might confuse the chain of command she was trying to establish, but mostly because being there without Frank felt like trying to inhabit a space where I no longer belonged. But when I walked into the workshop the next morning and saw Chen carefully restoring a Victorian-era music box using techniques Frank had taught her and tools he'd selected and maintained, I felt his presence so strongly that I had to sit down and catch my breath. This wasn't just a business, it was a living extension of Frank's hands and heart, a place where his knowledge and passion continued to breathe life into broken things. Chen looked up from her work and smiled with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Eleanor, it's so good to see you here. We've missed having you around." Her words carried no hint of the awkwardness that Sarah had suggested my presence might create. Instead, she seemed genuinely pleased to see me, eager to show me the projects she was working on and to share stories about techniques Frank had taught her. As we talked, I realized that Sarah had been creating an artificial separation between me and the workshop, suggesting that my involvement would complicate her management approach, when, in reality, Frank's craftsmen valued the connection to his family and welcomed my interest in their work. The awkwardness wasn't coming from my presence. It was coming from the uncertainty about the workshop's future and their place in it. That conversation with Chen opened my eyes to something I'd been too trusting to see clearly. Sarah hadn't just been managing Frank's business, she'd been systematically isolating me from it, creating a narrative where my involvement was a problem to be solved rather than a connection to be preserved. When I mentioned to Chen that I'd been considering learning more about the business operations myself, her face lit up with enthusiasm that contradicted everything Sarah had told me about the burden this would place on the employees. "Mrs. Eleanor, that would be wonderful," Chen said with genuine excitement. "Mr. Frank always said that you had the best eye for quality and detail of anyone he knew." The craftsman's skills can be taught, but the ability to see what something should become, that's a gift. You've been around this work long enough to understand it better than any outside manager ever could. Her words planted a dangerous seed of possibility in my mind. What if Sarah was wrong about my capabilities? What if the complexity of running Frank's business wasn't as overwhelming as she'd made it seem? What if the real challenge wasn't my age or inexperience, but Sarah's need to control a situation that she'd decided required her management? I spent the next few weeks quietly investigating my own business, asking questions I'd never thought to ask, reviewing documents that Sarah had been handling exclusively, and discovering that Frank's operation was far more straightforward than the corporate complexity Sarah had been describing. The business had 3 craftsmen, a handful of regular clients, and a reputation that generated referrals organically. The bookkeeping was detailed but not complicated. The insurance was standard small business coverage, and the tax obligations were manageable with the help of the same accountant Frank had used for 15 years. Most surprisingly, I discovered that the business was significantly more profitable than Sarah had been indicating. Not enough to make anyone wealthy, but certainly enough to provide a comfortable living while preserving jobs for skilled craftsmen and continuing Frank's tradition of museum-quality restoration work. The financial picture Sarah had been painting, with its emphasis on the need for major changes and optimization, seemed designed to create urgency rather than reflect reality. It was during this period of quiet investigation that I began to notice how Michael's behavior changed whenever his mother discussed the business sale. He'd become withdrawn and anxious, losing his usual enthusiasm for visiting the workshop and asking fewer questions about his grandfather's work. When I gently asked him about it, he initially claimed he was fine. But children are rarely good at maintaining pretenses with grandparents who know how to wait patiently for truth. "Grandma," he finally said one afternoon when we were baking cookies together, "I heard Mom talking on the phone about selling Grandpa's shop, and she sounded different. Not sad like when someone you love dies, but excited like when you get something you really want. She was talking about using the money to start her own business and maybe moving to California where the hotels pay better. But what about us? What about you and me and the workshop?" His question revealed the heart of my growing unease. Sarah's plans for the business sale weren't really about protecting Frank's legacy or ensuring my security. They were about funding her own fresh start after her divorce. The workshop that Frank had built over 4 decades was being viewed as Sarah's inheritance to liquidate rather than my husband's legacy to preserve. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. I called Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson and asked if they'd be willing to meet with me at the workshop on Saturday morning. I wanted to understand their perspective on the business, their concerns about its future, and their thoughts about the possibility of my taking a more active role in operations. The conversation that followed was one of the most enlightening of my 74 years. Frank's craftsmen revealed that they'd been deeply worried about the potential sale, not just for their own job security, but for the integrity of the work they'd been trained to do. They'd overheard enough of Sarah's phone conversations to understand that the corporate buyer was primarily interested in the client list and workshop space, with plans to convert the operation into a higher volume, lower quality business model that would maximize profit at the expense of craftsmanship. "Mrs. Eleanor," Rodriguez said with the respectful formality he'd always shown Frank and me, "your husband taught us that restoration work is about respect for the past and responsibility to the future. The people who want to buy this place, they talk about efficiency and throughput and market optimization. Those aren't the words of people who understand what we do here." Patterson, who had found healing in the meditative precision of restoration work after her own husband's death, was even more direct. "This place saved me when I thought my life was over," she said with quiet intensity. "Working with my hands, bringing beautiful things back to life, being part of something that honors the past instead of discarding it, this work gave me purpose again. If you're willing to learn the business side, I'd be honored to help teach you whatever you need to know." Their willingness to support my involvement in the business operations contradicted every assumption Sarah had made about the burden my presence would create. Instead of seeing me as an obstacle to efficient management, Frank's craftsmen viewed me as a connection to the values and standards that had made the workshop special. They weren't looking for a corporate manager to optimize their productivity. They were looking for leadership that understood and preserved the soul of what they did. That meeting changed everything for me. For the first time since Frank's death, I felt capable and valued, surrounded by people who believed in my ability to learn and grow, rather than people who saw my age as a limitation to be managed around. The craftsman's confidence in me awakened a strength I'd forgotten I possessed, a reminder that being 74 didn't mean being helpless or irrelevant. Over the following weeks, I began what I secretly called my stealth education in business management. Every morning, I'd arrive at the workshop before Sarah's usual visits, spending time with the craftsman and learning the practical aspects of running Frank's operation. Rodriguez taught me about project timelines and material costs. Chen walked me through client communication protocols, and Patterson showed me the filing systems that Frank had developed over the years. What I discovered was both humbling and empowering. The business side of Frank's workshop wasn't the incomprehensible maze of complexity that Sarah had described. It was a well-organized system that Frank had simplified over decades of experience. He'd developed streamlined processes for everything from initial client consultations to final project delivery, and his craftsmen had learned these systems so thoroughly that they could guide me through them with patience and clarity. The more I learned, the more confident I became that I could handle the responsibilities Sarah had convinced me were beyond my capabilities. Frank's accountant, whom I finally called directly instead of relying on Sarah's summaries, was surprised to hear that I'd been considering selling the business based on financial concerns. "Mrs. Henderson, your husband's shop is one of the most stable small businesses I work with," he told me with genuine confusion. "The profit margins are excellent, the client base is loyal, and the overhead is manageable. I'm not sure why anyone would want to change a successful formula." But the most revealing conversation came when I called the corporate buyer that Sarah had been negotiating with, ostensibly to ask questions about their offer, but really to understand their intentions for Frank's workshop. The conversation was chilling in its casual dismissal of everything Frank had built. They were indeed primarily interested in the client list and the workshop's reputation, with plans to streamline operations by focusing on higher volume, faster turnaround projects that would maximize profit per square foot. When I asked about Frank's craftsmen, the corporate representative was diplomatically evasive. "We'd certainly evaluate all existing personnel for potential retention," he said, in the kind of corporate speak that says nothing while implying everything. "Of course, our operational model might require some staffing adjustments to optimize efficiency and meet our quality standards." The translation was clear. Frank's skilled craftsmen, who had spent years learning his techniques and standards, would likely be replaced by lower-paid workers trained to produce faster, cheaper results. The workshop that Frank had built as a sanctuary for traditional craftsmanship would become another profit-focused operation where quantity mattered more than quality. That night, I sat in Frank's favorite chair and tried to imagine him hearing about these plans for his life's work. I could almost see his expression of quiet disappointment, the same look he'd get when a client wanted him to rush through a restoration just to meet a deadline or cut corners to reduce costs. Frank had always believed that some things were more important than immediate profit, that preserving traditional skills and maintaining quality standards was a responsibility to both the past and the future. It was during this reflection that Michael arrived for his usual after-school visit, his soccer practice having been canceled due to rain. He found me sitting in his grandfather's chair, surrounded by business documents and financial reports, and settled onto the floor beside me with the comfortable familiarity of a child who'd spent countless hours in that same spot listening to his grandfather's stories. "What you reading, Grandma?" he asked, looking at the papers scattered around me with the same curiosity he'd shown about Frank's restoration projects. "I'm learning about Grandpa's business," I told him honestly, "trying to understand how everything works so I can make good decisions about what should happen to it." Michael was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness that children sometimes bring to adult matters they sense are important. "Mom still wants you to sell it, doesn't she?" he asked finally. "She thinks it would be best for everyone," I replied carefully, not wanting to put him in the middle of adult disagreements, but also not wanting to dismiss his perceptive observations. "But you don't think so anymore?" he pressed, reading my uncertainty with the clarity that comes from loving someone deeply enough to notice their emotional shifts. I'm not sure, I admitted. I'm learning that maybe I'm more capable of handling things than your mother and I initially thought. But I'm also learning that selling might mean changing everything your grandfather built, and I'm not sure that's what he would have wanted. Michael nodded thoughtfully, then reached over to pick up one of the financial reports I'd been reviewing. Can you teach me about it too? He asked. I mean, I know I'm just a kid, but Grandpa always said that understanding how things work is the first step to taking care of them properly. The request surprised me, but as I began explaining the basics of Frank's business model to my 12-year-old grandson, I realized that teaching him was helping me solidify my own understanding. Michael asked simple, direct questions that cut through complexity and forced me to think clearly about fundamental issues. Why did the business need to change if it was already successful? What made Frank's approach special compared to other restoration shops? How could we honor his values while ensuring the workshop's survival? As we talked, I began to see a path forward that didn't require choosing between preserving Frank's legacy and ensuring practical sustainability. What if the real solution wasn't selling to a corporation or completely restructuring operations, but simply learning to manage what Frank had already built successfully? What if the stability everyone was seeking was already there, hidden beneath layers of unnecessary complexity that Sarah had created in her eagerness to optimize and modernize? That evening marked a turning point in my thinking about Frank's workshop and my own capabilities. For the first time since his death, I began to believe that I could learn to carry forward what he'd built, not by transforming it into something unrecognizable, but by understanding and preserving the systems and values that had made it successful in the first place. The next few weeks passed in a blur of discovery and growing confidence. Every day brought new understanding about aspects of Frank's business that had seemed mysterious, but were actually quite logical once explained. The insurance policies weren't incomprehensible legal documents. They were standard coverage for equipment, liability, and business interruption that could be managed with annual reviews and minor adjustments. The client relationships weren't fragile arrangements requiring constant corporate-level management. They were personal connections built on trust, quality work, and fair pricing that maintained themselves through satisfied customers and word-of-mouth referrals. But the most significant discovery was how much Frank's craftsmen had been hoping for exactly the kind of stable, values-based leadership I was beginning to believe I could provide. They'd been watching Sarah's corporate approach with growing concern, understanding better than I had initially realized that her optimization plans would fundamentally change the nature of their work and potentially destroy the collaborative atmosphere Frank had created. Mrs. Eleanor, Chen confided to me one afternoon as we reviewed a complex restoration project together. Your husband always said that the most important tool in restoration work isn't skill with your hands, it's respect for the original craftsman's intentions. When we restore a piece, we're having a conversation across time with someone who cared enough to create something beautiful and lasting. Your daughter talks about efficiency and throughput, but those concepts don't honor that conversation. Her words crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. Frank's workshop wasn't just a business. It was a bridge between past and future, a place where traditional skills were preserved and passed forward. Sarah's plans would turn it into a modern business operation that might be more profitable in the short term, but would lose the essential character that made it valuable in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. It was during this period of growing clarity about my own capabilities and desires that Sarah's pressure campaign intensified dramatically. She'd apparently been expecting my quick agreement to the sale based on our previous discussions, and my requests for more time to consider the decision were clearly frustrating her timeline. Her weekly visits became daily phone calls, her gentle suggestions became urgent recommendations, and her concern for my well-being began to feel more like manipulation than care. "Mom, I'm worried that you're overthinking this," she said during one particularly tense conversation. "The buyer's offer is generous, but it's not going to remain on the table indefinitely. These corporate decisions move quickly, and if we delay too long, we might lose this opportunity entirely." The artificial urgency was familiar from her hotel management approach, where creating time pressure often pushed clients toward decisions they might otherwise reconsider. But I was beginning to recognize Sarah's professional tactics when they were directed at me, and the recognition was both enlightening and disturbing. My own daughter was treating me like a client to be managed, rather than a mother whose concerns deserved respectful consideration. When I suggested that perhaps the corporate buyer wasn't the only option, that maybe I was becoming confident enough to continue operating the business myself, Sarah's reaction was swift and sharp. "Mom, that's completely unrealistic. You're 74 years old with no business experience. Do you have any idea how stressful it would be to manage employees, deal with insurance companies, handle tax obligations, and maintain client relationships? The responsibility would be overwhelming." But I'd been learning to handle exactly those responsibilities for weeks, with guidance from Frank's craftsmen and support from the same professionals Frank had worked with for years. The tasks weren't beyond my capabilities. They were simply new to me, requiring learning and adjustment rather than the complete surrender of control that Sarah was advocating. Michael had been observing these increasingly tense conversations with the careful attention that children pay to family dynamics that might affect their security. One evening, after a particularly heated discussion where Sarah had accused me of being unreasonably stubborn about the sale, Michael found me in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner with more force than necessary, clattering dishes and wiping counters with the sharp movements of suppressed frustration. "Grandma," he said quietly, settling onto a kitchen stool where he could watch my face, "are you mad at Mom?" The directness of his question stopped me mid-wipe. Children have a way of cutting through adult complexity to ask the questions that matter most, and Michael's simple inquiry forced me to confront feelings I'd been trying to avoid acknowledging. "I'm not mad at your mother," I said carefully, then corrected myself with the honesty that children deserve. "Actually, maybe I am a little mad, but mostly I'm disappointed that she doesn't seem to believe I'm capable of learning new things or making my own decisions about Grandpa's workshop." Michael nodded, with the understanding of someone who'd experienced similar underestimation. "Mom sometimes treats me like I'm too young to understand things that I actually understand pretty well," he said. "Maybe she treats everyone like they can't handle stuff that they actually can handle." His observation was startlingly perceptive. Sarah's management style, which had probably served her well in corporate environments where establishing authority and controlling outcomes were valued, was poorly suited to family relationships that required trust, respect, and collaborative decision-making. She was managing me rather than supporting me, treating my concerns as obstacles to overcome rather than valid perspectives to consider. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I called Frank's lawyer, not the estate planning specialist Sarah had introduced me to, but the small business attorney who'd handled Frank's legal needs for over a decade. I wanted to understand my options for maintaining control of the workshop while learning to manage it effectively, and I wanted advice that wasn't filtered through Sarah's assumptions about my limitations. The conversation was eye-opening in ways that made me question everything Sarah had told me about legal necessities and business complications. According to Frank's longtime lawyer, there was no urgent need for succession planning or management transitions. The lawyer's advice was both reassuring and revealing. "Mrs. Henderson," he said in the patient tone of someone who'd spent decades explaining legal concepts to small business owners, "your husband structured his business very carefully to ensure that you'd have complete control and flexibility after his death. There's no legal requirement for you to make any immediate decisions about succession or management. You own the business outright, and you can take as much time as you need to decide how you want to proceed." His words directly contradicted the urgency Sarah had been creating around legal documentation and business transitions. The papers she'd been pressuring me to sign weren't protective necessities. They were voluntary transfers of control that would benefit her far more than they would protect me. Frank had already provided for my security and decision-making authority through his original business structure. More disturbing was the lawyer's observation about the corporate sale Sarah had been promoting. "Mrs. Henderson, I've reviewed the offer your daughter mentioned, and frankly, it significantly undervalues your husband's business. The buyer seems to be taking advantage of what they perceive as a distressed sale situation, offering about 60% of what the business is actually worth based on its assets, client relationships, and earning potential. That evening, I sat Michael down for a serious conversation about what I'd learned and what I was planning to do. He listened with the focused attention he'd inherited from his grandfather, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that surprised me with their maturity. When I told him about my decision to keep the workshop and learn to manage it myself, his face lit up with a joy that confirmed everything I'd been feeling about the rightness of this choice. "Grandma, that's awesome," he said, throwing his arms around me with enthusiasm. "Mom's been talking about moving to California if the shop sells, but I don't want to move. I want to stay here with you and keep learning about Grandpa's work. Maybe someday I could even work in the shop myself." His words revealed the final piece of the puzzle I'd been assembling. Sarah's plans for the business sale weren't just about funding her fresh start. They were about creating the freedom to relocate without family obligations holding her back. Michael and I were secondary considerations in her vision of optimized independence. That night I called Sarah and informed her of my decision. The conversation was as difficult as I'd expected, filled with accusations about my stubbornness, warnings about the burden I was taking on, and predictions of failure that revealed more about her own insecurities than my actual capabilities. But I remained firm in my choice, supported by weeks of learning and the confidence that Frank's craftsman had helped me develop. The final confrontation came 3 days later when Sarah arrived at my house with the sale papers I'd been avoiding, determined to pressure me into signing while she still believed she could control the outcome. She spread the documents across my dining table with the efficient movements of someone closing a business deal, explaining each section with the patronizing patience of someone who decided that persistence would eventually overcome resistance. That's when Michael burst through the front door in his soccer uniform, fresh from practice and unaware of the tense scene in the dining room. But when he saw the papers spread across the table and his mother's expectant expression, he understood immediately what was happening. The desperation in his voice when he shouted, "Don't sign those papers," came from a 12-year-old's pure fear of losing everything stable and familiar in his world. Looking at Michael's terrified face as he begged me not to sign those papers, I realized that this moment represented more than just a business decision. It was about choosing between the comfortable path of surrendering control and the challenging path of maintaining responsibility for what Frank had built. It was about deciding whether to trust Sarah's assessment of my limitations or to believe in the capabilities I'd been discovering over the past months. Most importantly, it was about honoring not just Frank's legacy, but also the family relationships that would survive long after business decisions were made. I set down the pen and looked at Sarah with the clarity that comes from finally understanding a situation completely. "I'm not signing these papers," I told her calmly. "I've decided to keep Frank's workshop and learn to manage it myself. The craftsmen are willing to help me. The business is more profitable than you indicated, and I'm more capable than either of us initially realized." Sarah's reaction was immediate and intense. "Mom, this is a huge mistake. You're 74 years old making an emotional decision that you'll regret when the reality of business ownership hits you. You don't understand the daily pressure, the constant decision-making, the financial risks that come with this responsibility." But I'd been living with those responsibilities for weeks, learning to handle them with guidance from people who understood Frank's values and priorities. The pressure Sarah described wasn't the crushing burden she'd portrayed. It was the normal challenge of running a small business, manageable with experience and support. "Sarah," I said, gathering the papers into a neat stack, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not making this decision emotionally. I've spent months learning about the business, talking to Frank's employees, consulting with his accountant and lawyer, and discovering that I'm more capable of handling this than you believed. More importantly, I've learned that preserving Frank's workshop doesn't require selling it to people who don't understand what makes it valuable." Michael moved closer to me, relief evident in his posture as he realized that his grandfather's workshop would remain in family hands. Sarah looked between us with the frustrated expression of someone whose carefully constructed plans had been derailed by unexpected resistance. Over the following months, my decision to keep Frank's workshop proved to be not just emotionally satisfying, but practically successful. With guidance from Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson, I learned to manage the business operations while preserving the craftsmanship standards and collaborative atmosphere that Frank had created. The workshop continued to attract high-quality projects, maintain its excellent reputation, and provide meaningful work for skilled artisans who understood the value of traditional restoration techniques. Michael became my unofficial apprentice, spending afternoons and weekends at the workshop, learning basic woodworking skills and absorbing the patient, detail-oriented approach that Frank had embodied. Watching him develop an appreciation for craftsmanship and quality gave me hope that Frank's values would continue to influence future generations, regardless of whether Michael ultimately chose restoration work as his career. Sarah's reaction to my decision evolved slowly from frustration to acceptance. Her plans for relocating to California were delayed, but not abandoned, and she eventually found management positions in Phoenix that utilized her corporate skills without requiring control over Frank's business. Our relationship required rebuilding trust and establishing new boundaries, but the foundation of family love proved strong enough to survive our disagreement about business decisions. The most satisfying aspect of my choice to keep the workshop has been the daily confirmation that Frank's approach to business was both financially viable and personally fulfilling. Each restored piece that leaves our workshop carries forward his commitment to quality and respect for traditional craftsmanship. Each satisfied client reinforces the value of maintaining standards rather than pursuing maximum efficiency. Each day that Rodriguez, Chen, and Patterson come to work in an environment that honors their skills validates the choice to preserve rather than transform. Looking back now, I understand that Michael's desperate plea for me not to sign those papers came from a child's instinctive recognition of what adults sometimes fail to see clearly. He understood that some things are worth preserving even when changing them might seem more profitable or practical. He recognized that my capability to learn and grow hadn't diminished simply because I'd reached a certain age. Most importantly, he saw that family legacy isn't just about financial inheritance, but about maintaining the values and relationships that define who we are. At 74, I've learned that the most important decisions often require choosing the more difficult path, the one that demands growth and learning rather than surrender and retreat. Managing Frank's workshop has challenged me in ways I never expected, but it has also revealed strengths and capabilities that I might never have discovered if I'd chosen the easier option of selling and stepping back. The papers Sarah brought that day remain unsigned in my desk drawer, a reminder of how close I came to making a decision based on other people's assumptions about my limitations rather than my own assessment of my possibilities. Michael's voice shouting, "Don't sign those papers," will always represent for me the moment when love and intuition trumped logic and convenience, when a 12-year-old's wisdom helped his grandmother find the courage to trust herself. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for our families is to resist their well-intentioned efforts to manage our lives for us. Sometimes preserving what matters most requires saying no to people we love when they ask us to make choices that would diminish rather than protect the things we value. And sometimes the voice of a child can cut through adult complexity to remind us of the simple truths that guide the best decisions. That capability isn't limited by age, that some things are worth fighting to preserve, and that love sometimes means holding on rather than letting go. This is my story of learning that it's never too late to discover new strengths, never too risky to bet on yourself, and never wrong to listen when someone who loves you begs you to reconsider a decision that might change everything. Sometimes, the most important words in any family are the ones that stop us from making irreversible choices. Don't sign those papers.